All right, let's get right into it. If modern dating feels like, I don't know, a total minefield for your brain, you are definitely not alone. But what if you could actually rewire your thinking to make the whole thing less stressful and, maybe even more successful? Today, we're going to dig into the work of a cognitive behavioral therapy specialist named Veronica Walsh and see how her insights can help you become your very own dating coach.
So, what is the root cause of all this dating stress? Well, honestly, it's Hollywood. I mean, as this quote points out, we've all been sold this complete fantasy, this idea that we're just supposed to wait for the perfect person, complete with a Tom Hanks voiceover, to show up and narrate our happy ending. But the reality of love, it's a lot more work, and it looks a whole lot less like a movie.
So here's our game plan. First, we'll break down that Hollywood fantasy. Then, we'll meet Veronica Walsh and her go-to tool, CBT, and figure out how to become our own coach. After that, we'll explore a totally new way to approach dating, see how it works for someone in a real transformation, and finally, we'll take a hard look at the story you're telling yourself.
Okay, so let's start right there, with that huge gap between what we see on screen and what actually happens in real life. Think about it. The movies usually end right when the real work of a relationship is just getting started. And this is where that whole myth really just falls apart. You see, finding a partner, turns out that's only about 10% of what makes a healthy relationship. The other 90%, that's all about relationship skills. And the best part is, unlike trying to find some mythical perfect person, skills are something you can actually learn. Which brings us to Veronica Walsh. She is a straight-talking cognitive behavioral therapist who's all about helping people build up their confidence by changing the way they think, especially when it comes to the crazy-making stress of dating. And just to get this out of the way, so we're all on the same page, when we say CBT, we are not talking about what one of the author's friends in the BDSM community thought she meant. Apparently, it's a pretty common and, let's be honest, a kind of hilarious mix-up.
No, the real CBT, Cognitive Behavioral Therapy, is this incredible tool. It's basically designed to help us spot and then change all those unhelpful thought patterns and behaviors that keep holding us back. And the goal is to replace them with new habits that can genuinely improve our lives.
This quote right here, it really gets to the core of Veronica Walsh's whole philosophy. She is constantly pushing back against this intense pressure we all feel to be in a relationship, no matter what. Because the goal isn't just to have someone, the goal is to be happy. And sometimes that means being happy on your own.
So why is this so important? Well, get this. According to molecular biologist Dr. John Medina, being stuck in a bad, stressful relationship for a long time is, biologically speaking, like sleeping next to a saber-toothed tiger every single night. Our brains just aren't built for that kind of constant stress. They're made for short bursts. Prolonged stress, it can literally make us sick and even cause parts of our brain to shrink. Seriously. Okay, so we've got a very real, very biological reason to avoid that saber-toothed tiger. But how? How do we actually do that? This is where the practical side of CBT really shines. It's all about learning to manage those stories we tell ourselves to, undistort our own thinking. Veronica Walsh breaks it down into this really simple 3-step process. First, you track your thoughts, maybe jot them down in a journal. Second, you examine those thoughts for common negative patterns, or what she calls distortions. And third, you reframe the thought by actively looking for a different, more balanced perspective. So what do these distortions look like? Well, they're these sneaky mental shortcuts our brains take that aren't really based in reality. There's mind reading, where you just assume you know exactly what someone else is thinking about you, making up a whole story with zero evidence. Then there's magnifying, where you make these huge, absolute statements like, men only want, which just isn't true. And then there's black and white thinking, which tells you things like, I'm not successful enough, as if there's no middle ground. Walsh says these kinds of absolute statements, they're basically never 100% true. And all of this leads to a pretty big question you have to ask yourself. Do I self-sabotage? To see how this all works in the real world, let's take a look at a case study from the source material about a woman who is nicknamed the recent dumpee. Okay, so here's what happened. The recent dumpee noticed the guy at the reception desk wasn't really making eye contact with her. Her immediate, distorted thought, it was a textbook case of mind reading. He must have heard something bad about me, and now he's judging me. It was a whole narrative she just created out of thin air.
And the actual reality? He had pink eye. That's it. It had absolutely nothing to do with her. This is such a perfect, almost funny example of how our worst fears are often just totally disconnected from a much more boring, simple reality.
So the big question is, How can we take these skills and apply them to the super high-pressure situation of a first meeting or a first date?
Well, Veronica Walsh has some amazing practical tips. First, try to go in with a sense of humor. And maybe don't even call it a date. That word just piles on the pressure, right? Just think of it as a meeting. Also, try to meet in person sooner rather than later so you don't build up this whole fantasy person in your head. And most importantly, give yourself permission to just be amused by the whole wild process and use your new skills to coach yourself through it.
And here it is. This is probably the most important self-coaching tool of them all. When you're feeling anxious or spiraling, just ask yourself this one question. What would I tell my best friend if they were in this exact situation? I mean, think about it. We are almost always so much kinder, so much more generous and rational with our friends than we are with ourselves.
So what ended up happening with our case study, the recent Dumpy? Let's check in on her transformation after she started actually using these CBT methods in her life.
Her journey is actually pretty inspiring. She started that thought journal, and it led her to this huge breakthrough. She realized a deep-seated fear of abandonment was driving a lot of her self-sabotaging behavior, and once she knew that, she felt confident enough to get back out there. And she even went on a second date with someone.
And here's how she got through it. When she was on a date and started feeling that old anxiety bubble up, she used that best friend trick. She coached herself. She literally imagined her friend telling her she looked hot and that everything was going to be okay. And by doing that, she calmed herself down. And you know what? Everything was okay. You see, this all really boils down to one incredibly powerful concept, the internal story that we are telling ourselves day in and day out. That little voice in your head, it has a massive impact on how you feel and what you do. And here is the biggest takeaway from all of Veronica Walsh's work. The real magic isn't about positive thinking or just wishing for the best. No, the magic happens when you actively engage with your thoughts. You use that three-step process. You track them, you examine them for actual evidence, and then you consciously do the work to reframe them and undistort them. So, I guess that leaves us all with one final question to think about. What is the internal story that you've been telling yourself? Is it some Hollywood fantasy? Or maybe something a little more critical? Because with these tools, you now have the power to pick up the pen and start writing a totally different ending.